The airport was buzzing with the usual mix of excitement and tension. Travelers hurried through the terminals, dragging suitcases, checking boarding passes, and trying not to miss their flights. There was a low hum of conversations, the distant clatter of carts, and the occasional announcement echoing through the hall. Among all the passengers, one woman stood out, not because of her appearance, but because of her presence. She walked with calm confidence, her steps measured and her gaze steady. She didn't rush, she didn't fidget, and yet she commanded attention without saying a word. Many people passed by without realizing it, caught up in their own world of delays, luggage, and last-minute gate changes. But there was an unmistakable aura around her. She had the quiet authority of someone who had spent years leading, someone who expected respect and gave respect in return. On the other side, the pilot of the flight was getting ready for the day's journey. He was a man used to being in control. Pilots are trained to command the cockpit, to make quick decisions, and to handle emergencies with calm precision. This pilot had flown many flights, faced stormy skies, mechanical issues, and demanding passengers, and he carried himself with a certain pride that came from being in charge. Today, however, his pride would lead to a moment of recklessness that neither he nor the passengers would soon forget. The boarding process was already chaotic. The gate agents were doing their best to manage the crowd, but delays had left lines longer than usual. People were impatient, shifting from foot to foot, glancing at their watches, muttering complaints. The woman approached the gate steadily. She had a ticket in her hand, but she didn't rush like the others. Her demeanor suggested that she was used to people trying to push her around, but she would not let them. She calmly waited for her turn, observing the situation, noting the frustration in the lines and the hurried energy of the airline staff. She was patient, but she was also prepared to assert herself if necessary. When it was finally her turn, the pilot, who had come out to oversee boarding, noticed her. Something in her calm, confident posture irritated him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Perhaps it was her unhurried pace. Perhaps it was the way she looked at him with clear, unflinching eyes, as if she could see right through his ego. Whatever it was, the pilot felt a surge of irritation. He prided himself on being in command, and here was a passenger who did not seem intimidated at all. He waved her forward a little more forcefully than necessary, and demanded she step aside for other passengers. The woman, however, did not budge. She explained politely but firmly that she had a seat assignment and was following all boarding procedures. Her voice was calm, her tone steady, but there was an unmistakable firmness in it that made it clear she would not tolerate nonsense. The pilot, already tense from the long day and the crowd's impatience, misinterpreted her calmness as defiance. In a moment of rash judgment, he reached out and smacked her on the shoulder, intending to move her along. The gesture was quick, almost instinctive, but it was enough to stun everyone nearby. Passengers froze, some gasping, some looking around in shock. The woman's eyes widened for a brief second, not from fear but from surprise. No one expected such behavior from a man in a position of authority, someone trained to handle tense situations calmly. There was an awkward silence. People exchanged glances, unsure of what to do, sensing that something serious had just happened. The pilot stepped back, satisfied with his action, thinking he had regained control, but he could not have been more wrong. The woman did not react angrily. She did not shout or create a scene. Instead, she slowly turned to the pilot, looked him in the eyes, and spoke. Her voice was steady, measured, and carried the weight of authority. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. Not in a threatening way, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she had to do next. The pilot laughed nervously, assuming she was joking. "I'm a passenger," he said, trying to brush it off, though his smile was forced and uneasy. She shook her head slightly and calmly stated, "I am the chief of police." The words hung in the air like a sudden thunderclap. The pilot froze. His face went pale, and for the first time that day, he felt completely out of control. He realized instantly what he had done. He had smacked not just any passenger, but someone whose authority far exceeded his own in a way he had never considered. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and the hum of the airport faded as the gravity of the situation settled in. Passengers stared, some mouths agape, some reaching for their phones. A few whispered to each other, trying to process the scene unfolding before them. The woman remained calm, her composure unshaken. She could have raised her voice, could have demanded immediate action, but she chose to stay collected. There was power in her restraint, and everyone could feel it. The pilot's ego, which had seemed so unshakable moments before, was now crumbling in the face of her authority. The airline staff quickly intervened. They tried to mediate, offering apologies and attempting to calm both parties. The pilot muttered something about being stressed, about long hours and chaos, but his words sounded hollow. The woman simply listened, her eyes steady, and waited. She wanted acknowledgement, not excuses. She wanted respect, not apologies that lacked sincerity. The passengers watched, some leaning in, sensing that they were witnessing more than just an airport incident. They were witnessing a lesson in humility, respect, and the consequences of impulsive actions. Inside, the pilot's mind raced. He replayed the incident over and over, realizing that one small moment of frustration had escalated into a public embarrassment. He could feel the weight of every passenger's gaze, and with it came a growing sense of shame. He had been trained to handle emergencies, but this was an emergency of a different kind, one that required tact, humility, and self-control, none of which he had shown in that moment. The woman did not demand immediate punishment. She did not call for authorities to be involved. She simply held her ground, reminding the pilot and everyone else that authority is not about titles alone, but about how one conducts oneself in moments of stress and conflict. Her calmness was almost magnetic. It drew attention, respect, and even admiration. Passengers who had been irritated by the boarding process now felt a deep empathy for her. They realized that the incident could have happened to anyone, that impulsive actions often lead to regret, and that true authority is recognized not in displays of force, but in restraint and dignity. As the pilot stood there, realizing the depth of his mistake, he tried to speak again. His voice wavered. I didn't know, he began, but the words felt inadequate. The woman looked at him, her expression soft but firm, as if acknowledging his acknowledgement. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a quiet assertion of her position and a reminder that actions have consequences. The moment stretched on. Airline staff continued their attempts to manage the situation, offering reassurances to the passengers, who had now become witnesses to an extraordinary lesson. The woman remained composed, speaking only when necessary, guiding the resolution with the same calm authority she brought to her role every day. The pilot, meanwhile, was left to reflect on how quickly pride and impulsiveness can lead to regret, and how a single action can define one's reputation in an instant. Passengers began to settle, some shaking their heads, some muttering about what they had just witnessed. They knew they had seen more than an airport incident. They had seen a reminder that respect, patience, and awareness are essential in every human interaction. They watched as the woman prepared to board the plane, her steps steady, her posture unyielding, and felt a mix of admiration and relief that she handled the situation with grace. For the pilot, this day would not be easily forgotten. It was a lesson in humility, a reminder that authority is not only about control but also about understanding, restraint, and respect for others, no matter the circumstances. The passengers, too, carried away a story they would tell for years, about the moment when a simple act of impatience met with extraordinary calm, and how dignity and composure can transform a tense situation into a profound lesson for everyone involved. As the plane doors closed and the engines roared to life, the woman took her seat, calm and unbothered. She had faced an unexpected challenge and turned it into a demonstration of quiet power. The pilot, seated in the cockpit, adjusted his controls, but he could not adjust the memory of what had just occurred. He had learned, perhaps the hard way, that authority and respect are earned in every moment, and that one careless action can erase years of perceived control in a single heartbeat. The passengers looked out of their windows, reflecting on the events with a mix of awe and amusement. Life often throws unexpected situations at us, but it is how we handle them that defines who we are. The woman had shown that even in a world of chaos, calmness, clarity, and confidence can turn a moment of conflict into a story worth telling. And for everyone on that flight, it was a story they would remember long after the journey ended. The moment after the pilot realized who he had just smacked felt like a sudden freeze in time. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the cockpit door, trying to steady himself. He had faced emergencies hundreds of times, turbulence, technical failures, angry passengers, but this was something entirely different. This was a personal embarrassment, A mistake that had nothing to do with flying a plane but everything to do with judgment, awareness, and respect. The passengers were still murmuring quietly, some leaning over to whisper to one another about what had happened. A few were cautiously taking out their phones but sensing the tension, most held back, realizing that this wasn't just entertainment. It was a real moment, a confrontation with weight and authority. The woman had remained calm, composed, and commanding, and that made the pilot's mistake feel even heavier. He tried to collect his thoughts, running through excuses in his head. Maybe he could blame the stress of the day, the long hours, the impatient passengers, the delay at the gate. But deep down he knew none of that mattered. None of those reasons justified his action. Smacking someone, anyone, especially in a professional setting, was unacceptable. And smacking someone like her, someone who clearly carried a presence of authority and respect, was a mistake he would instantly regret. The woman, meanwhile, did not appear angry or flustered. She simply looked at him with calm, unwavering eyes, and that gaze seemed to hold him in place. It wasn't intimidation in the threatening sense, but a quiet reminder of who she was and what she represented. She spoke again, softly but firmly. "You need to understand that actions have consequences. This is not just about me. It's about respect, professionalism, and responsibility." The pilot swallowed hard, feeling the weight of every word. For the first time that day, he understood the full meaning of the phrase, regret. It wasn't just about embarrassment or fear of punishment. It was about the awareness that one wrong action could ripple through many lives, leaving a mark far larger than anticipated. Passengers glanced at him, noticing the change in his expression, the way his confident posture faltered, the way his eyes darted around nervously. He looked smaller, diminished, humbled by the very person he had underestimated. The airline staff approached, sensing the need to act quickly. They tried to calm the situation, offering reassurances to both the woman and the pilot. "Sir, ma'am, please," one agent said politely. "Let's resolve this calmly." The pilot nodded mechanically, trying to gather his words, but each attempt seemed inadequate. I didn't mean," he started, but the words fell short of an apology that felt sincere. He could feel the eyes of every passenger on him, weighing him, judging him silently. The woman interrupted gently. "You need to apologize properly. Not just words, but understanding what you did wrong." She spoke in a tone that was firm but not cruel, a voice that demanded respect without needing to raise it. Her words were simple, yet they carried immense power. The pilot nodded again, taking a shaky breath, and then spoke more clearly, trying to let the weight of his words match the reality of his actions. "I am truly sorry," he said, looking directly at her. "I should not have done that. I lost my patience, and it was completely wrong." She accepted his apology, but she didn't simply let it go. She reminded him, "Apologies are just the first step. Accountability comes with action. You need to reflect on why this happened and ensure it doesn't happen again." The pilot nodded again, the repeated gesture reflecting the depth of his realization. He understood that this was more than a personal mistake. It was a moment that could have consequences for his career, his reputation, and the trust people placed in him. Passengers were watching every second. Some were silently nodding in approval, impressed by the woman's calm and composed handling of the situation. Others were whispering to friends or family about what they were witnessing. "She's incredible," one murmured. Calm, confident, and she didn't overreact. Another said quietly, "The pilot looks completely out of his depth. He never expected this." The atmosphere in the plane shifted from tension to a kind of silent reflection, as people absorbed the lesson unfolding in front of them. The pilot's inner thoughts were chaotic. He replayed the moment over and over. "How could I have done that?" he thought. "I should have stayed calm. I should have remembered that every passenger deserves respect. I shouldn't have let frustration control me." The recognition of his mistake was crushing, but it was also clarifying. He realized that being in control as a pilot wasn't just about operating a plane. It was about managing human interactions, handling tension, and keeping composure even when provoked. Meanwhile, the woman had settled herself, standing with quiet authority. She didn't need to shout or threaten. Her presence alone reminded everyone that power was not just about position or title. It was about confidence, restraint, and moral authority. She demonstrated that strength could be quiet, and still command respect far greater than anger or aggression ever could. The airline staff worked to resolve the situation administratively. They asked the pilot to step aside briefly while they spoke with him privately. Passengers murmured among themselves, some expressing surprise that such an incident could happen in a professional environment. Others reflected on the courage it took for the woman to handle the situation so calmly. They saw a person who could have escalated the moment, but chose instead to teach a subtle yet powerful lesson in composure and dignity. The pilot, left alone for a moment, could feel the adrenaline slowly fading, replaced by a gnawing sense of regret. He realized he had learned a lesson that no simulator, training manual, or experience could teach. This was real. This was human. One impulsive action, one lapse in judgment, and the consequences were immediate and unavoidable. The woman had reminded him without raising her voice that humility and respect were essential in every situation. He also reflected on how society often judges authority differently depending on appearances. He had assumed, based on superficial perception, that the woman was just a passenger. He had underestimated her because of assumptions he didn't even realize he was making. That misjudgment had led to a mistake he would never forget. He understood now that authority comes in many forms, and the true measure of leadership is not who shouts the loudest, but who acts with fairness, composure, and integrity. Passengers watched as the pilot returned, head lowered slightly, ready to resume his duties. The woman remained standing, calm and composed, a silent example of dignity. No one needed to be told who held real authority in that moment. It was obvious in the way she carried herself, in the quiet confidence that radiated from her. The contrast between her calm and the pilot's regretful posture was striking. Even outside the immediate incident, the airport environment seemed different. People talked quietly among themselves, some expressing admiration, some reflecting on the lessons learned. A few passengers whispered to friends, "That could have been me," or "I would have reacted so differently," realizing the human vulnerability in all of them. They saw how quickly pride and impatience could lead to mistakes, and how patience, composure, and awareness could turn a tense situation into a moment of clarity. As the pilot returned to his cockpit, he could feel the eyes of passengers on him, but he did not meet them. He was focused inwardly, thinking about how he could make amends, how he could learn from the mistake, and how he could ensure it never happened again. The woman took her seat, quietly buckling in, her calm presence a stark contrast to the pilot's inner turmoil. The engines roared to life, signaling the start of the flight, but the tension had shifted. It was no longer about confrontation. It was about reflection, awareness, and growth. Passengers settled in, but the memory of the incident lingered. They remembered the quiet authority, the lessons of respect, the humbling effect of a single impulsive action. Some took mental notes, thinking about how they might handle conflict differently in the future. Others felt a sense of relief, seeing that even in tense moments, composure and dignity could prevail. For the pilot, the flight became a journey of reflection. He checked instruments, reviewed procedures, but his mind kept returning to the moment of impact, to the calm authority of the woman, and to the realization that respect and humility are as critical as skill and experience. He had learned a lesson far beyond flight manuals or emergency drills. It was a lesson about humanity, perception, and personal growth. The woman, quiet and composed, glanced around the cabin briefly, noticing the subtle nods of passengers who had witnessed the interaction. She did not need praise or acknowledgement, yet the respect was evident. It was not her intention to be noticed, but simply to act rightly and assertively in the face of wrongdoing. That quiet strength made the moment unforgettable. As the plane climbed into the sky, the pilot understood something essential. Every interaction, no matter how small, matters. Every decision, every action, every word can carry weight far beyond the immediate moment. One mistake can teach more than 1,000 successes, and one calm, dignified response can teach more than any reprimand ever could. The lesson of that airport gate would stay with everyone on the plane for a long time. The pilot, humbled and reflective, had confronted his own shortcomings. The passengers had witnessed a moment of authority, grace, and moral clarity. And the woman, the chief of police, had shown that real strength lies not in aggression but in patience, awareness, and dignity, even in moments when no one expects it. By the time the flight settled into cruising altitude, a quiet understanding had spread across the cabin. People were more aware, more thoughtful, more respectful. The story of that brief but powerful moment was already taking shape in their minds. A reminder that life often tests us in small but significant ways, and that how we respond defines who we truly are. The tension in the cabin did not fade. If anything, it grew as the pilot's initial shock wore off, and the reality of the situation sank in. The airline staff moved quickly, realizing that a proper resolution was needed before the flight could continue. One of the gate managers approached the woman, bowing slightly in acknowledgement of her authority, while another gently guided the pilot aside. The pilot, still pale and shaken, tried to regain a sense of control. He muttered something about stress, delays, and long hours, but his voice lacked conviction. He had learned the hard way that excuses carried no weight in this moment. The woman watched him silently, her calm gaze like a mirror reflecting his own lack of composure. He could feel the weight of every eye in the cabin upon him, passengers observing each small movement, each subtle expression, and judging not only his actions but the person he had been in that moment. The gate manager spoke to the pilot first, trying to keep the tone professional and neutral. "Sir, please understand that this is a serious matter. We need to discuss it before takeoff." The pilot nodded, his throat tight, words failing him. He knew that the conversation ahead would be uncomfortable, possibly humiliating, but he had no choice but to face it. He followed the manager toward a small private area near the gate, leaving the passengers and the woman behind. Meanwhile, the woman remained seated, observing the situation without losing her composure. Her posture was relaxed yet authoritative, a combination that seemed effortless but clearly came from years of experience. She did not need to assert herself loudly. Her presence alone demanded respect. Some passengers glanced at her, whispering quietly, impressed by how she maintained dignity, while the pilot, a man used to controlling situations, had crumbled under a single impulsive act. Inside the private area, the pilot was confronted with the gravity of his mistake. The manager laid out the airline's expectations calmly but firmly. "Physical contact with a passenger is unacceptable," he said. "Even if you were frustrated or tired, this cannot happen. You need to acknowledge what you did and take steps to ensure it never happens again." The pilot nodded, his hands gripping the edge of a counter, as if holding on to his remaining composure. He felt the shame of his action like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He tried to speak, but his voice shook. I know it was wrong," he admitted. "I didn't think and I reacted impulsively. I am truly sorry." The manager studied him silently, then gave a small nod. "Your apology is necessary, but it is only the beginning. There may be further review or training required. You need to understand the seriousness of this incident." The pilot swallowed hard, realizing that the consequences might go beyond embarrassment. This was a lesson in accountability, one that could affect his career if handled poorly. Back in the cabin, passengers were still watching quietly. Some had begun speculating about what might happen next. Whispers floated through the rows. "Will he get in trouble?" She didn't overreact at all. She was so calm. "I can't believe someone in his position acted like that." Their curiosity was mixed with admiration for the woman's patience and professionalism. They could sense that this moment was more than just a simple incident. It was a display of integrity, restraint, and authority. The woman remained calm, adjusting her seatbelt and taking a deep breath. She was aware of the passenger's attention, but did not let it influence her actions. She had faced stressful situations before, had dealt with people under pressure, and knew that the key to handling conflict was to remain composed, even when others failed to do so. She understood that this moment could have escalated into chaos, but she had chosen to keep it under control, showing everyone present how dignity could diffuse tension more effectively than anger. After several minutes, the pilot returned, his expression a mixture of shame and anxiety. He approached the woman cautiously, aware of the power imbalance that had shifted dramatically in a matter of moments. The passengers watched as he hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Then finally he spoke, his voice low but sincere. "I want to apologize directly to you," he said. "I lost my temper and it was completely unacceptable. I am very sorry." The woman nodded, accepting the apology but also using the opportunity to reinforce the lesson. "I accept your apology," she said, "but I want you to understand something. Respect is not optional. It is required in every interaction. Every person deserves it regardless of their position or your mood. If you forget that, you risk more than embarrassment. You risk harm to your reputation, your career, and to the people around you. Her words carried a weight far beyond the immediate situation. The passengers listened quietly, many reflecting on how easily human interactions can spiral out of control when patience is lost. Some thought about their own behavior in stressful situations, realizing that a moment of impulse could lead to consequences they had never considered. The woman's calm authority had transformed what could have been a chaotic incident into a teaching moment for everyone present. The pilot, standing with his head bowed slightly, felt the full impact of the lesson. He had always thought of himself as competent, in control, and professional. Yet here he was, humbled by a single act of impatience and by a passenger who commanded far more respect than he had initially assumed. He realized that authority and skill are not enough. Humility, awareness, and respect are equally important. The airline staff spoke again, this time addressing the passengers. "The situation has been resolved. Thank you for your patience." The passengers nodded, some clapping quietly in acknowledgement of how the woman had handled everything. They felt the relief that the tension was easing, but also a lingering respect for the poise and dignity displayed. They had witnessed something rare, a conflict resolved through composure and authority rather than aggression. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the pilot returned to the cockpit, still thoughtful, still reflecting on the chain of events that had unfolded. The engines roared to life, but in his mind the real turbulence was internal. He understood that the day's events had taught him more than any flight manual could. He had learned about human behavior, about respect, about the importance of controlling impulses, and about the weight of his actions on others. The passengers buckled in, some still whispering among themselves about what had occurred. They marveled at how quickly a routine day could transform into a lesson about authority and human interaction. They noticed that the woman, the chief of police, was composed and calm, as if the incident had barely disturbed her. Her professionalism had turned a potentially explosive situation into an example of dignity and restraint. The woman herself reflected briefly on the experience. She understood that power could be intimidating, but it was the way one exercised it that mattered most. She could have escalated the incident, demanded punitive action, or expressed anger, but that would not have served any purpose. Instead, she chose to guide the situation toward understanding, reflection, and accountability. That choice not only resolved the conflict but also left an indelible impression on everyone in the cabin. The pilot, seated in the cockpit, thought about how easily human judgment could fail. He realized that even someone trained to handle emergencies could make a mistake when emotions were involved. His respect for the woman grew, not only because of her position, but because of how she managed a difficult moment with calm authority. He knew he had been lucky to encounter someone who could turn a tense confrontation into a lesson, and he silently vowed to carry this lesson forward in both his professional and personal life. Passengers watched the plane ascend, some thinking about their own encounters with stress and impatience. They reflected on how quickly misunderstandings could escalate and how much impact a single act could have. They recognized that authority, composure, and calmness could transform a stressful situation into a moment of learning and growth. As the flight leveled off, the pilot finally exhaled deeply, feeling a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. The lesson of the day was clear. Humility, patience, and respect are critical no matter how skilled or confident one may be. He understood that authority does not excuse impulsive behavior, and that every interaction carries consequences, often larger than expected. The passengers settled into their seats, some quietly discussing the incident, others reflecting in silence. They had witnessed an extraordinary demonstration of calm authority and accountability, a reminder that human interactions are delicate and that one impulsive action can alter a situation dramatically. They appreciated the woman's poise, the pilot's eventual accountability, and the way the airline handled the resolution professionally. The woman, calm and composed, looked around the cabin briefly, sensing the respect and quiet admiration of the passengers. She had maintained her dignity, enforced accountability, and taught a subtle but powerful lesson. She didn't need acknowledgement, but the passengers recognized it anyway. It was a moment that would stay with them, not because of drama or conflict, but because of the way it revealed the importance of respect, restraint, and integrity. For the pilot, the day would remain unforgettable. He had learned about human behavior, the fragility of authority, and the power of composure in moments of conflict. The experience humbled him, forced reflection, and instilled a new awareness of the responsibilities that come with professional authority. He realized that respect must be earned, maintained and exercised at all times, and that mistakes, however small, could carry far-reaching consequences. The flight continued, but the events at the gate had left a lasting impression. Passengers reflected on what they had seen, carrying the story in their minds as a reminder of the human capacity for patience, authority, and dignity. The woman had turned a tense moment into a lesson for everyone present, showing that true strength lies not in anger but in calmness, awareness, and moral clarity. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the tension had eased, but the lesson remained. The pilot sat quietly, reflecting on how quickly pride and impatience could lead to regret. Passengers glanced around, some nodding quietly, some silently appreciating the calm authority of the woman. The chief of police had not only handled the situation with grace, but had also reminded everyone on that flight of the value of respect, patience, and composure. The plane was now cruising steadily at a comfortable altitude, and for a moment it seemed as if the tension from earlier had faded completely. Yet inside the cockpit, the pilot could not escape the weight of what had happened. He sat quietly, hands gripping the controls lightly, though not because of the flight. It was the memory of the woman, the chief of police, that occupied his mind. He replayed the incident over and over, analyzing every movement, every word, every expression. He could still see the shock in the passenger's eyes, the calm authority in her gaze, and the overwhelming sense of regret that had washed over him the instant he realized who she was. The airline staff had returned to their positions, attending to passengers and preparing for the flight's continuation. The cabin crew moved efficiently, but there was an unspoken acknowledgement of the earlier event. They had witnessed a rare moment where patience, authority, and accountability intersected in a way that left a strong impression. Their conversations, though quiet, were filled with subtle admiration for the chief of police and reflection on the pilot's moment of lapse. Some crew members whispered to one another about how unusual it was to see someone in authority handled so gracefully while the person in charge faltered completely. Meanwhile, the woman herself sat calmly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked around the cabin occasionally, noting the subtle nods and glances of passengers who had witnessed her calm and firm handling of the situation. She did not seek recognition, yet it was clear that she had earned respect in a way that went far beyond her official title. The passengers felt it. They had seen someone act with dignity, restraint, and moral authority, turning a potentially tense situation into a lesson for everyone present. The pilot, still in the cockpit, knew that the resolution was not complete until he fully acknowledged the gravity of his actions. He had apologized earlier, but it was not enough to simply speak words. He needed to show understanding, accountability, and a willingness to learn. He reached for his intercom and hesitated briefly, gathering the courage to speak. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but carried a tone of humility that had not been there before. "To all passengers on board," he began, "I want to sincerely apologize for my actions earlier. What I did was wrong, and I take full responsibility. I hope you understand that I deeply regret this moment and will ensure it never happens again." The cabin was silent for a few moments. Passengers listened intently, many feeling a sense of relief that the pilot had finally recognized the seriousness of his actions. Some whispered quietly to each other, expressing approval of his acknowledgement. The chief of police nodded slightly, acknowledging the pilot's words, though her expression remained calm and composed. Her purpose had never been to humiliate, but to demonstrate accountability and proper conduct in a challenging situation. After his announcement, the pilot reflected on what had led to the incident. He remembered the crowded boarding area, the long delays, and his own growing impatience. He realized that he had allowed frustration and ego to override common sense and professionalism. That brief lapse in judgment had caused embarrassment, potential legal issues, and a lesson that he would carry with him for the rest of his career. He understood now that every interaction mattered, and that authority without humility could lead to disastrous results. The chief of police, observing the pilot's acknowledgement, made a small mental note of how quickly human beings can be humbled when confronted with calm authority. She knew that her role was not just about enforcing laws, but about guiding people toward understanding, fairness, and respect. Her approach was deliberate. She had chosen to respond with calmness rather than anger, to teach rather than punish, and to demonstrate that strength lies not in force but in composure. Passengers watched her carefully, absorbing the lessons without her needing to say a single word. They reflected on their own behavior in stressful situations, realizing how easily impatience and assumptions could lead to mistakes. Many silently acknowledged that the world needed more people like her, those who could handle conflict with grace and dignity, those who could turn potentially negative situations into opportunities for learning. The airline management later made a formal statement to the pilot. They emphasized the importance of professional conduct, the need for accountability, and the requirement for additional training in handling stressful situations and passenger interactions. The pilot listened attentively, feeling a mix of humility and determination. He knew that this was not a punishment but an opportunity to grow and ensure that he would never repeat such an error. Meanwhile, the passengers continued their journey. Though the incident had left a lasting impression, some quietly discussed the earlier event, marveling at how the woman had maintained composure under pressure. Others reflected on the pilot's accountability and the way he had finally admitted his mistake publicly. There was a sense of closure, but also a lingering awareness of how quickly human interactions could go awry and how much could be learned from even the smallest moments of conflict. The flight attendants made subtle adjustments, providing extra care and attention to passengers, ensuring that the atmosphere in the cabin returned to one of comfort and ease. Their professionalism complemented the lesson already taught by the chief of police, showing that calm, composed responses could restore balance after tension. The passengers felt reassured, not just by the crew's actions but by the underlying message that accountability and respect mattered in every interaction. The pilot, reflecting on the situation, realized that this event would remain with him for the rest of his life. It was not just about being corrected by a passenger who happened to be in a position of authority. It was about understanding human behavior, acknowledging mistakes, and taking responsibility. He had faced situations where skill and experience mattered, but this was different. This was a moment that tested his character, his humility, and his ability to respond appropriately to conflict. The woman remained composed throughout, occasionally scanning the cabin with quiet confidence. She understood that leadership was not about dominance but about guiding others toward understanding and accountability. Her calmness inspired respect, and her measured actions left an impression that would stay with the passengers and the pilot alike. She had turned a negative encounter into a positive lesson, demonstrating the power of patience and authority exercised with wisdom. Passengers reflected on the incident in different ways. Some considered their own moments of frustration in life, realizing how easily impatience could lead to regret. Others thought about the value of calm authority and how one person's composure could influence an entire environment. Even those who had never experienced such a confrontation could feel the impact of witnessing it, understanding the broader lessons about respect, accountability, and human behavior. The pilot, still processing the event, made a silent vow to himself. He would take the lessons learned seriously, applying them not only in his professional life but in his personal interactions as well. He recognized that authority carried responsibility, and that mistakes once made could have consequences far beyond the immediate moment. He understood that humility, patience, and awareness were as important as technical skill in his profession. The chief of police, observing the pilot's reflection, felt a quiet satisfaction. She had achieved her goal, not through force or anger, but through measured authority and composure. She had demonstrated that even in situations where someone misjudges or acts impulsively, calmness and accountability could lead to resolution and understanding. She had shown that leadership was about guiding, teaching, and inspiring respect, not about asserting dominance. As the flight continued, the cabin atmosphere gradually shifted toward normalcy. Passengers settled into their routines, some reading, some looking out the windows, some quietly reflecting on what they had witnessed. The pilot focused on the instruments, but he carried the lesson with him in every action, every decision. He understood that his behavior had been observed, analyzed, and remembered, and he was determined to live up to the standard set by the woman he had misjudged. The story of the incident would eventually reach others beyond the flight. Passengers would recount the experience to friends and family, sharing the remarkable example of calm authority and accountability. They would describe how a tense moment had been transformed into a lesson for everyone present, highlighting the importance of respect, composure, and moral clarity. The chief of police had not only handled the situation with professionalism, but had also left a lasting impression on all who witnessed it. For the pilot, the lessons were deeply personal. He had been humbled, reminded of the importance of patience, and forced to confront his own impulsiveness. He realized that mistakes are not just opportunities for punishment, but chances for growth and self-reflection. The experience had taught him more about human behavior and professional responsibility than any training program or manual ever could. The woman, calm and composed, finally allowed herself a small sense of relief. The situation had been resolved without escalation. The pilot had acknowledged his mistake, and the passengers had witnessed an example of true authority exercised with wisdom. She had demonstrated that leadership is not about asserting dominance, but about guiding others toward understanding, accountability, and respect. Her actions had turned a moment of conflict into a moment of learning and growth for everyone involved. As the plane continued toward its destination, a quiet sense of balance returned to the cabin. The passengers felt reassured, inspired, and reflective. The pilot carried the weight of his mistake, but also the lessons he had learned. And the chief of police, composed and dignified, remained an example of how calm authority, patience, and accountability could transform a tense, potentially negative situation into a profound human lesson that would be remembered long after the flight ended. The plane finally began its descent, and a quiet sense of anticipation filled the cabin. Passengers were adjusting their seats, fastening seatbelts, and preparing for landing. But the events of the day were still fresh in everyone's minds. The tension, the embarrassment, and the lesson that had unfolded earlier had left a lasting impression on the pilot, the passengers, and, of course, the chief of police. While the plane hummed steadily, people quietly reflected on what had just happened, realizing that one small incident could teach so much about human behavior, respect, and accountability. The pilot, still seated in the cockpit, felt a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. Relief that the immediate confrontation was over, that the flight was proceeding safely, and that no one had been physically harmed. Anxiety because he knew the repercussions of his action were far from over. He understood that while he had apologized and acknowledged his mistake publicly, there would likely be follow-up consequences from the airline, and perhaps even further scrutiny from outside parties. He reflected on how quickly life could change in a single moment, how one act, one lapse in judgment, could ripple outward and create lessons, embarrassment, and self-reflection that would last for a long time. Passengers were chatting quietly among themselves, some exchanging their impressions of what had occurred. There was a mixture of admiration, relief, and curiosity. Many were still thinking about the calm authority of the chief of police, how she had maintained her composure, and how her measured response had turned a potentially explosive situation into a lesson that everyone could learn from. People were impressed not just by her position, but by how she handled the conflict with dignity and patience. They were witnessing a rare demonstration of leadership that didn't rely on force or anger, but on respect, awareness, and self-control. The airline management had already begun documenting the incident. They took statements from staff and passengers, reviewing the event carefully. The pilot would likely undergo retraining in passenger management, conflict resolution, and professional conduct. While he had apologized and acknowledged his mistake, the airline understood that education and accountability were essential to prevent similar incidents in the future. It was not about punishment alone. It was about ensuring that every professional understood the importance of respecting passengers and handling tense situations appropriately. The chief of police remained composed throughout the documentation process. She did not demand special treatment or attention. She simply cooperated, demonstrating professionalism at every step. Her focus was not on humiliation or revenge, but on ensuring that the incident served as a lesson. For the pilot, for the airline staff, for passengers, and indirectly, for anyone who might hear about the story later, her calm and deliberate actions left a strong impression, showing that true authority comes from wisdom, patience, and the ability to guide rather than punish. The pilot, reflecting on the consequences, realized that this experience had changed him. He had always prided himself on his competence and control in the cockpit, But this incident reminded him that authority and skill alone were not enough. Respect, humility, and patience were just as important. He knew he had acted impulsively and allowed his ego and frustration to dictate his actions. And that one misstep could damage not just his reputation, but the trust that passengers place in him every day. Passengers continued to reflect on the day's events. Some quietly thought about similar moments in their own lives, times when impatience or frustration had led to mistakes. Others considered the lessons they could carry forward, that even in moments of stress, composure and dignity could defuse tension, and that respecting others was essential in every interaction. The story of the chief of police and the pilot had become more than an airport incident. It had become a story about human behavior, accountability, and the power of calm authority. When the plane finally touched down, the cabin filled with the usual sounds of movement, passengers gathering belongings, flight attendants assisting, and wheels rolling along the tarmac. Yet, despite the return to normal activity, the memory of the earlier incident lingered. Passengers remembered the calm demeanor of the woman, the pilot's sincere apology, and the way the situation had been resolved without further escalation. It was a rare example of how patience, awareness, and composure could turn a tense moment into a lesson for everyone present. As passengers disembarked, some approached the chief of police quietly, expressing admiration for how she handled the situation. They thanked her for demonstrating leadership, calmness, and professionalism. Others shared stories of their own experiences, reflecting on how witnessing this incident had given them perspective on patience, respect, and accountability. Even small gestures of acknowledgement made it clear that her actions had left a profound impression on those who observed her. The pilot, meanwhile, stayed back briefly, completing the final checks and preparing for debriefing with airline management. He knew that the incident would be reviewed thoroughly and that his professional conduct would be evaluated. He felt a mix of nervousness and resolve. Nervousness because he had made a visible mistake, and resolve because he had learned a critical lesson that would guide him going forward. He realized that accountability was not just about facing consequences, but about internalizing lessons and applying them consistently in daily life. In the days that followed, the story began to spread quietly among airline staff. Passengers who had shared their experiences, and eventually even in the media, carefully framed to highlight the lessons rather than sensationalize the conflict. It became a story about respect, professionalism, and the importance of remaining calm under pressure. The chief of police's handling of the situation was praised widely, not because she held a high position, but because she had demonstrated courage, patience, and authority in a moment that could have easily gone wrong. The pilot received formal training and counseling from the airline. While the airline emphasized that he had made a mistake, they also acknowledged that his willingness to accept responsibility and learn from it was an important part of professional growth.